Hi, everybody in podcast land and also on YouTube. This is Carpool Critics. I'm James.
I'm David.
I'm Riley.
And I'm Kirk.
Whoa.
Whoa.
Thanks for joining us today, our guest, Kirk.
Happy to.
Kirk is a musician. He's the host of the podcast Strong Songs and Triple Click, the video gaming podcast, and a former writer at Kotaku. Welcome, Kirk.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very happy to be here to talk about movies.
And today we're talking about Whiplash.
Spoiler alert! Oh, I thought the camera was over there, but it's here. Spoiler alert, guys!
Yeah, we got a new camera setup today. Maybe people will just like it more, so hit us up in the comments or tweet at us if you think we should just do this, if this is the way that we should just do forever now.
I'd like it, but I'm having a real trouble not looking at you, James. I'm going to try. I'm going to try to stay focused.
Whew. This is nice. It feels like you're all looking at me, which is kind of nice. It's a little bit intimidating, but I'll take it.
We are.
David, what do you rate this movie out of 10?
Whiplash dares to pose the question, what is the price of greatness, while itself being only very good? 7.9.
Dang, dude. That's rude.
Riley?
After Spider-Man drives him insane, Jonah Jameson reinvents himself as a psychopathic music teacher on a mission to create the most deranged jazz band the world has ever seen. And he's starting with the fundamentals, drums. Can't wait for the sequel. 8.5 out of 10.
8.5, pretty good. Man, yeah, he's got high standards for photos, web crawlers, and drums. Whiplash is an ensnaring drama that hits all the character beats, but ultimately drops the sticks when it comes to realism. But nonetheless, 7.8 out of 10. I think it's a good movie. It's great.
So I got to give my rating now? Is that how this works?
Yeah, let's hear it.
Okay. A technically brilliant, provocative portrait of an abusive relationship set in a nightmare world starring nightmare people with a distorted view of jazz and music instruction that exists entirely to set up and validate an unsatisfying, wrong-headed conclusion about the pursuit of artistic excellence. 5 decibels out of 10.
Heck yeah, dude. Yeah. Okay.
Can you explain your rating system? Like, what is a 5 out of 10 to you?
Well, I don't rate things. We never rated games at Kotaku, and I'm actually like very strongly opposed to numerical ratings. So I thought about like rating it an impossible rating and taking a philosophical stand, but then I decided it's your podcast, so I will do that.
We appreciate that.
I'm just treating it as 5 out of 10 because like I see this movie as like a really amazingly made movie, like on a technical level that totally fails in some very frustrating ways in terms of the writing, and then specifically the jazz, which we can get into on this show. So only because like that's extremely my area, and it was hard not to become very fixated on a lot of the jazz aspects of this movie, even though I think its strengths are actually like outside of that. Like it's a much better movie about abuse, I guess, in a certain way than it is about art, or especially about jazz. So I have a lot of thoughts about all of that stuff that I want to
hear them. But also, I want to just hold on a second. So why are you against numerical ratings?
Yeah, this is a debate that we had on our podcast many times.
Yeah, we tried to drop numerical ratings, and our audience did not let us.
Yeah.
I think audiences like them, and I think that they can be valuable. Like, I think there's something to be said for just, if you want a recommendation on something, you can go to Metacritic, and it'll tell you, Zelda Breath of the Wild is a good video game, Whiplash is a good movie, or whatever. Like, you'll see a high rating, and it'll tell you that generally speaking, people like this thing, which can be very useful in our current age of like content overwhelm. There's so much stuff. You just want to know what's good. You want a wire cutter for art. Fine. You can go get that. And so like, I get why people value it, especially why audiences value it. As a critic, at least as a game critic, it was like, I just never could come up with a number to put on something. It was the worst part of anytime I've done a scored review, which is pretty infrequently, it's always the worst part. Like, you write this long thing about all the like nuances of your take and like what you think of this thing and how it compares to all this other art and what you got out of it and your experience. And then at the end, you're just like, and now I have to just be like, well, it's better than this, but worse than that. I think it's bad for discourse. Like, I think that in video games, at least, there's so much discussion around like, well, he gave this an 8 and he gave that game a 7, so he's saying this game is better than that game. And it's like, I don't know, like one was a football simulator and the other one is like a Tetris clone. Like it's like they're so different that
But they're both 8s. They're exactly the same quality of game.
So it has like there's a rhetorical problem with it because it like levels everything out. Where especially in video games this is an issue because one video game can be like a super gameplay light narrative experience. The other can be like a really deep simulation. The games can be so many different things that trying to have a standardized review score just makes no sense.
I'm not even sure that we brought them back because the audience made us bring it back. I mean, for me, it was because I wanted to keep arguing with David about
It's a
his
fun
rating.
thing
That's
to
what the
argue
audience
about.
wanted to hear
Yes.
too. Everybody
Yes.
wanted to hear the arguments.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
thanks
get
for-
that. Like, it's a fun thing to argue about because it gives you this like place to hang your hat at the beginning of the argument.
Right.
Well, I gave it a 5 and you gave it a 10. So like, let's argue about those 5 points and what that means. I don't know. I've never been a huge fan, but it's also sort of fun to give this movie a rating.
Yeah.
Especially that I
it's
gave it the
important-
lowest rating. That makes me.
Oh man,
That
I
makes
think
me
it's
happy.
important to not take them too seriously too, because
Yes.
as we've seen, I change my ratings constantly, and I think based on what you just said, I might lower my rating. I don't know,
We'll see
my
at the
God.
end.
but we'll see.
I think you should be allowed to do that. And that's actually another
Yeah.
thing. We could talk about this forever, but like in video games, there's a whole thing where like game studio bonuses are based on Metacritic. Like a part of the industry is built around review scores. And that to me is
Right.
not good and part of a sort of toxic, bad part of the game's industry. So I
There's like a
also don't
moral
like that. And I
responsibility.
don't like being a part of that system. So I always appreciated that.
Oh, that's
that we
bizarre.
didn't
Although I
have
guess
numbers.
it's a little better than game sales.
I mean, but sales at least reflect like the money that like you're making off the game and thus the number of people you can employ and like how much money goes back then to the people who made it if in bonuses. Like that at least there's sort of a through line there. When it's just
Right.
critics, especially when like Metacritic has like a lot of review sites I've never heard of, or it's just sort of questionable how they even do it, or they assign a rating to people who didn't give a score. Like that just feels so much more subjective that it's, I don't know, it's always rubbed me the wrong way.
Have you ever acutely felt that you contributed to that machine where like you gave something a really glowing or really bad review and it really affected the people?
I mean, not in the Metacritic way, only because most of my reviews weren't scored. But yeah, I mean, when I've written really glowingly about a game or talked about a piece of music, you know, on Strong Songs, like people, you'll hear from the people who made it sometimes, and they'll be really happy that someone liked it, and that's nice. I don't think you hear as often from the people who aren't happy that you said something critical, though I've certainly, you know, sometimes gotten the sense that people weren't happy that I said something critical. So I guess it goes both ways.
I felt this one time.
Oh, yeah.
I
I'm
wrote
sure.
the review. I wrote the script for the Linus Tech Tips review of Jibo, which was like an animatronic, like digital assistant kind of robot. And then we excoriated it. And then within a year, they went out of business.
Oh no!
And I was like, oh my God. Like,
But you know, you
Whoopsies.
just explained to people that the product wasn't good, and they probably went out of business because the product wasn't good, not because you
Yeah.
told people it wasn't good, right?
well, but it's everything. It's like capitalism is a distributed kind
Sure.
of thing we all participate in. And I just played my role. But that was just how it shook out. Like I played my part.
It's a hard
it just
balance.
was really weird because, you know, I talked to the people who were affected by that.
Well, I think
Yeah.
regardless, we don't have to feel too bad about rating this movie since it came out in 20.
And Damien
14?
Chazelle is doing fine. This movie did fine.
Yeah, so it's okay, guys.
Yeah, let's start actually talking about it right after this message from our sponsor, Private Internet Access. PIA VPN helps you hide your true IP address so you can bypass geo restrictions and censorship. And did you know, Riley, did you even know that
What?
you can connect up to 5 devices at once? And it includes an internet kill switch if your VPN gets disconnected involuntarily. PIA is available for Windows, Mac, Android, iOS, and even as a Chrome extension. So check it out at lmg.gg/carpoolpia.
I wasn't proud of that one.
Yeah, it was not your best.
Yeah, no, I've done better. I'll bring it back, guys. Don't worry. I'm sorry, Kirk.
I accept your apology. Do better.
disappointment.
I mean, I expected better too. So.
Oh man. Okay.
So why don't we get started with things that we do like
Wait.
about this movie?
We have to remember what happened in it.
Oh, yeah, Riley, tell us what happened.
I wrote the synopsis, guys.
I
You
haven't
just
watched
skip
it since
over
2014.
Good gravy. Andrew Neiman is an ambitious young jazz drummer at the prestigious Schaeffer Conservatory who is selected for the school's studio band by Terrence Fletcher, an instructor known equally for his teaching talents as for his tendency to hurl chairs at people. Fletcher's harsh teaching style and Neiman's hunger for greatness spiral into obsession. Will Neiman prove to his family that music is a valid career choice, or will he run out of Band-Aids? We never find out, because the movie ends right at the end of a sick jazz number. Hope it turned out all right.
Jazz makes everything better, so I'm sure it's fine.
Yeah. After that, everyone was like, hey, man, nice to see you. I'm going to move on with my life.
So you want to start with the things we like?
I think so.
You liked it the most, so hit us.
Did I like it the most? No, Riley likes it the most.
I gave it an 8.5, but it might go down. You know?
Okay, you know what?
Someone with integrity tell us what they like.
I think I like how clear the theme of this movie is. How it's stated. It's what's the price of greatness? What does it cost to be excellent. And the whole movie is about that. I think it gets distracted at a few points, but it does a really good job of posing that question. Do I like the answer it comes up with at the end? That's up for debate. What do you guys think about that? Andrew has to pay this great price to be great, and you think that he's going to give up. You think that the price is too great, but then it turns out that there is no price too great. What do you think about that?
I think that I was taken in by the conversation the movie makes you have between, when you start watching the movie, you're kind of like, all right, is he going to learn at some point that there are prices too great to pay for greatness, or are we just gonna watch a man descend into insanity? And I feel like, especially at the part where he kind of takes a turn and it seems like he's gonna turn out all right, but then he kind of just
Are you talking about the part where he goes and gets a day job and he's no longer drumming and
you're like, oh, okay, is he gonna end by saying no to this whole toxic machine? But then, he at the end we've all seen the movie. He says yes to the toxic machine, but it's like I don't know whether that's the movie telling us that this is okay or whether I don't think that's.
I feel like it merits. We don't always explain stuff scene by scene, but I think for our discussion, it merits just explaining what happens at the end of this movie, which is actually totally sick and redeeming. I was kind of losing interest. I remember on my first viewing of this movie, by the time you get to the part where he gets in the car accident and he just pulls himself out of his covered in glass, grabs his sticks, and runs from this scene of the car accident to make it to the show on time. I was kind of like, I don't know.
That was the point for me as well, where I was like, I don't know about this.
But then, after he disgraces and gets his instructor Fletcher fired, time passes. He sees Fletcher at a bar. Fletcher sees him. They talk for a bit. I guess they bury the hatchet, and then Fletcher invites him to play on stage because his current drummer sucks. So he's like, hey, come drum for me in this competition we're doing. And then when Neiman shows up there, Fletcher's like, ha, gotcha. We're going to play a song you never played before. So, and instead of just walking away right then, Neiman tries to stumble through it brutally. He doesn't even play a consistent beat throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, okay, we'll talk about that later.
And then he does leave the stage. It's brutal. He's disgraced. He'll never work in this town. His career's over before it even started. That sucks. But wait a second. He turns around. He goes back to the stage. He sits down on the kit and just takes control of the whole situation, plays like he's never played before. Fletcher's furious, saying he's going to gouge his eyes out, but then he's impressed because Neiman kind of breaks through into the greatness that Fletcher, I guess, always wanted him to ascend to. And then he goes, you know what? Okay, this is pretty cool. And then they just jam out until credits roll.
Now this is jazz.
Is it? Is it?
What I was gonna say about when he doesn't know the song and he's just floundering trying to keep up. To me, I was almost like, that doesn't sound that bad. I was like, this is kind of jazzy, to be honest, because it's just there's no wrong notes, man. Just go
jazzy.
for it.
Yeah. What would you guys have done? I would have just walked away. As soon as I know that he's fucking me over and he's going to play a song I've never played, I would have just gotten up, left, maybe come back for the next song. But
what if the movie ended there, though? Because the reason it's satisfying is because he comes back and he's like, fuck you, Fletcher.
Oh, that's interesting.
No, fuck you. Because the whole time they've had this power struggle where Fletcher is always domineering and always yelling. And in the one time at the beginning where Neiman is marches into his office and yells at him, he just gets yelled over top. Fletcher just yells even louder and goes, not right now, not today. He just read a text message he didn't want to read or something at that moment. And so he never gets to control the situation until now. He's got the loudest instrument on the stage.
Well, that's an interesting question because I think thematically it would be a stronger movie if he actually did walk out and that he just gives up and it's that's that. But because it's a movie and it has to give us that visceral release, he has to go back and he has to give the big fuck you to Fletcher. And so does that make it a better movie or does it make it a worse movie to have that scene in it?
I think if he had just walked off when he knew that he was getting screwed over, then it actually would have been a crappy movie. He either has to totally flub it and he's ruined, or he has to go, fuck you, and totally slay it. It's either or. If he just said, oh, I'm getting screwed over right now, and he walked off, that would be weak. What would I be left with?
No, certainly after the flubbing. What do you think?
Oh man! So let me weigh in here. So
Kirk, what do you think?
Well, so the ending of this, it's I guess the ending of this movie suggests that this pursuit of greatness has led him here, and then he's broken through and achieved greatness. But to me, it left me asking so many questions, and I think that that's fine. I don't think this movie needs to tell us one way or the other. what it thinks or what it wants us to think, even though it certainly suggests that artistic greatness is the same as killing yourself to achieve some sort of technical excellence that you can then use in an almost like violent way to to basically abuse your abuser in public, which is a really dark thing. And I think this is a really dark movie, like from start to finish. I like that about it. I think it's also a really intimate movie, and that is something I liked about it. While we're listing things we like, I think the way this movie is edited, this won the Academy Award for editing. I wrote down his name. His name is Tom Cross, is the editor on this and on La La Land. And he's very, very good at what he does. Because the editing of this movie, the way that it puts the two of them together, even when they're in a crowded room, in a full rehearsal space, on a stage, you get this feeling. It's so claustrophobic. It's cutting between these very tight shots of J.K. Simmons and Miles Teller, and it's going back and forth. There's a great thing during that finale where the camera is literally swinging between the drums and then Fletcher, as he's giving these cues to the band, as they play that caravan performance at the end. So it's really well made. It's just that I don't, as a jazz musician, so I should say going into this, we've said I make strong songs, but I literally was I went to a really high octane jazz high school. I studied jazz saxophone performance in college at the University of Miami, which is a very high level jazz school. I did exactly this. I was in a program. Well, the program was actually very different than this kind of perverse one that they depict at the Schaeffer School, but I lived in that world, so I'm very intimately familiar with all of it. So as a result, I think I struggled with more of the particulars than a lot of people probably would, which is actually kind of on me and not the point. We can talk about some of the particulars because they're fun for me anyways to nerd out about maybe later. But just I think that thematically, you can almost read this ending as a dream. And I think some people have tried to read it that way, though I do believe Damien Chazelle, writer-director, has dispelled that and been no, this really happened. Because it almost feels so much of this movie feels like a dream to me. And so many of the set pieces in the movie are specific musician nightmares. You showed up to rehearsal, but you don't have your music, or you it's your first big day at the rehearsal and you're going into the top band that you've been promoted to and you oversleep and you have to run to get there on time, or you lose your sticks and they're going on stage, or it's on and on and on. And then the biggest one is at the end where you sit down to play at a really high prestigious show and you have the wrong chart and everybody else starts playing some other tune and you're looking through your folder and you don't know it and you've never heard it before. And
see,
what a nightmare.
David and I have had high school band experiences, but you didn't study music in post-secondary, right?
No, just
and I didn't either. I was very involved in band, so I relate with some of those. But
you're actually at the same level as the director then, and that's actually I think one of the problems is that he had all these memories from high school, and he knows some of the jargon and how it works from high school band, but he actually did not go to a post-secondary music school, and that's why this movie's in a weird place to the layman who's maybe just kind of into music.
Yeah.
Or maybe likes consuming music but doesn't play music. This was a great music movie, finally. But then, if you're a jazz musician like Kirk is, then it's well, this is actually not quite right. And then, so who's it really for then?
Right. I guess, that's very true. So Damien Chazelle he played jazz at a very intense jazz high school, which, like I said, I attended one of those too, and they can be intense. A lot of this movie does feel more like the high school jazz world than the college jazz world, which are very different. The collegiate jazz world just isn't, at least in my experience, and I can only speak to my experience, but it isn't about competitions and that kind of strict discipline because everyone is much older, and a lot of the top jazz bands in the country, I mean, there are post-grad guys and doctoral students who are in their 30s and 40s, who are, we, in the Miami band, I was in the top band my senior year, our lead trumpet player had been in the Duke Ellington big band. It was they're professionals who then go to get their doctorate and go to some of these top programs. So it isn't...
They're not trying to impress anybody.
The band at the Schaeffer School looked like that. It did have some more mature students in the band.
They did, but it's a different vibe. And Eastman is all undergrad, and maybe Schaeffer is an all undergrad program, so it's a little bit different. Some of the university level places, these are all particulars that we don't need to get into. I think though that the fact that it exists in this kind of weird non-world that's a mix of high school and college it kind of abstracts it in a way and sort of makes it easier to focus on just the dynamic that they're trying to explore between these two characters and not get as bogged down in the music. But it's hard for me only because it relies on such a distortion of so many things about jazz and jazz performance and jazz musicians to arrive at its conclusion that I like really struggled with it in the end, because like if you went up on, there's just so many ways that would play out differently, and they aren't just technical quibbles. Like if you went up on stage and you didn't have a chart, and you looked at the bass player and you're like, dude, I don't have a chart. I mean, first of all, you would have rehearsed with the band. So I guess there's just like, you would never go on stage having never rehearsed, and like, you would know, right? And the bass player would cover you. He'd be like, you would find a way to make it work. Like bands, when you're on stage, you make it work. Like you help the guy next to you out. There isn't this like cutthroat mentality, certainly not in a band. Like
that's one of the biggest things with this movie I've seen criticized, is that there's no camaraderie between the people. Like they're getting abused as a group, you know, but they don't have each other. You see the effect of the culture that Fletcher is cultivating on them. A lot of them are really high strung and they're really like shitty to each other rather than kind of commiserating.
Yeah. I thought that was super weird.
Well, it's believable in the context of his band. Like the way that like abuse trickles down and he's so cruel to all of them and they're cruel to one another, and he's created this culture of like people turning on one another. That was, to me, was believable. But in a professional setting, this wasn't his student band at the JVC Jazz Festival at the end. That was just a big band that he was directing, I guess. And like, and when you're in a performance setting, it just, any musician who's played in a band like that knows like there's a survival instinct that kicks in where you help one another out and you make it work. And like the fact that there's a lot of stuff about the drumming that I could complain about, but like the fact that he just kind of went off and was like trying to fake it and no one was helping him and he's just like totally on Mars with the tempo. It was like, it was a swing tune. It wasn't something totally crazy. It had some figures that he might have missed, but he could have just played time. And any drummer,
it sounded like he was just trying to play in a completely different time signature than what the song was.
Which like they had to emphasize, which gives it like a more of this dreamlike quality where you're like, I should be doing this because I know how to play a swing feel, but I can't, and I'm totally fucking up, and like everything is falling apart because it's a nightmare almost.
I guess you could explain it by he got into his head and wanted to be too fancy or something, but I really think it's just for the audience, because if you just played in time, a lot of people watching would just be like, that sounds okay.
Right, no, exactly. And it makes the story work, which is sort of going to be the case with any movie that's about like a specific trade or craft or something. You have to make it a kind of exaggerated, ridiculous version of it in order to kind of make the story work. And if you're focused more on the story than on the craft itself, like if the story is working, it's not as big of a deal if the particulars are wrong. I think in this case, the fundamental question of this movie, which is like, how hard do you have to push yourself to achieve artistic excellence? And like, is there anything to the type of teacher who is like an abusive or, you know, like really aggressive, really pushing teacher to get greatness out of somebody?
Are there no more harmful words in the English language than good job?
Right. It's just that because it like, I'll talk about the Joe Jones thing in a second, I guess, because that's a crucial part of this. But it relies on a false telling of one of the like formative jazz myths in order to reinforce, essentially in the end, if you take it at face value, reinforce the idea that the way to become great is to abuse yourself and push yourself until you achieve this very specific kind of technical excellence on the instrument that misses actually some really important things about music and about jazz that have nothing to do with like whether you can play steady time at 360 beats per minute.
So the story there that they reference throughout the film is that there's a famous
Charlie Parker.
Yes.
One of the.
Well, there's two famous musicians, and Charlie Parker shows up to rehearsal and he doesn't perform well enough, so the other one,
Joe Jones,
throws a cymbal at his head, almost decapitating him.
Yes.
And that he goes home because he sucked that night, but then that motivates him to try harder, and then eventually he became one of the greats. But in real life, I think he threw a cymbal at his feet or something like that.
So yeah, let me tell the verse. This
He
is a
just
story
dropped it.
that people hear. So there's a good, Charlie Parker is the musician in question, the genius in question. Papa Joe Jones was the drummer in Count Basie's band. He was a great drummer, but Charlie Parker is one of the greatest jazz musicians who ever lived. He like invented bebop vocabulary. Everybody, like he's amazing. Charlie Parker, great guy to listen to. There's a cool book called Bird Lives that Ross Russell wrote. That's like what I'm basing this on, but everybody hears this story. And it's that Charlie Parker grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, big jazz scene there. And I think it was like the 1920s maybe, coming up as an alto player and didn't fully understand like what jazz was, but he was genius. I mean, he had like an incredible mind, and he started learning. And I think the way, I might be misremembering this, but I think the way the story goes is he learned this tune, Honeysuckle Rose, which is like a standard tune. And he learned the chord changes to Honeysuckle Rose, and he kind of thought that that was it. Like once you knew Honeysuckle Rose, that was music, because he had like learned that and he just didn't know a whole lot. Then he goes up on stage at a jam session, which is just where, you know, the stage will be kind of open and musicians can just go up and play, and you get like a chorus and you get to do your thing, and it's kind of a good way to meet people. And back then it was like a really good way to start your career, and it's really high pressure. And he goes up there and he's playing, and he starts playing Honeysuckle Rose, but they're playing some other tune. And he like doesn't even understand that he's in the wrong key, so he's kind of all over the place. That's one version of it. I think there are other versions, but basically he's like not playing well, nothing makes sense. And he gets gonged off the stage, which is something that apparently Joe Jones would do when like a kid got up there and was just kind of sucking wind. He would like throw his cymbal on the stage and it would be like on the floor, and you'd be kind of humiliated in front of everyone.
Yeah.
And then there is a story like Bird went to the Ozarks or something like that and practiced and like finally figured it out and got his act together and became one of the greatest jazz musicians who ever lived.
Enlightened.
So he keeps telling the wrong version of the story, which if the movie then had somebody show up and tell the correct version of the story, which is like a much less violent and like more particular version of it, that would have been cool. There was kind of no one in the movie to speak up for jazz. And it's not like the movie needed to be about that because it was so laser focused on the dynamic between these two characters. But even in La La Land, like John Legend have you guys seen La La Land? Have you all seen that movie?
Yep.
So that movie also...
Same director.
So same director, Damien Chazelle. And that movie also revolves largely around a white character, I should say, with a kind of weird view of jazz, who thinks of it as this one certain thing and like thinks jazz is dying and that it needs to be saved, and is very kind of conservative in this particular way. At least La La Land has the John Legend character who's kind of there being like, dude, we're making really good music over here. Like, jazz is alive and well. You could come play in my band and like thousands of people will come see you and you'll get to play really cool improvised solos, and like the music of jazz is alive in what I'm doing. Even though that movie I think still doesn't fully understand jazz, this movie didn't have that at all. So
yeah,
it's just
one thing that's a
view.
shame.
Does anyone really understand jazz?
Well, it's a shame that
Yes, lots of people. He romanticizes it in a way that I don't always find that interesting or maybe that helpful. And I think it's just he just sort of misses the point. Like there's a discussion in this movie where he's kind of rationalizing. It's when they're having dinner at the bar, and Fletcher is saying basically like, this is why jazz is on life support, is because there's no more greatness and because we're not pushing people hard enough. And he's basically an abuser who's come up with this rationale for like pushing people as hard as he does, because he's
that's
like,
one of my problems with the movie though, is that there's no one who says like that's not okay. In that scene, he's kind of like redeemed. He's like, I'm not going to apologize for trying to get great musicians in the world.
Yeah.
And you're kind of like, okay, I get you now. And you're excused. It's okay now.
It's hard because I was just going to ask, is it possible that this movie is actually trying to depict jazz wrongly as a statement about how insane these people get in the pursuit of success? But at the same time, we don't have anybody else in the movie who's like, hey, this isn't jazz. It just lets you figure it out.
The movie doesn't ever indicate in any way that it sees this view as anything like. It's meant to be claustrophobic. It's meant to focus on these two characters, but just like you just said, like it never gives you the sense that it understands some deeper truth about the music, and that then makes me just sort of a little suspicious of the conclusions that it draws in the end, only because there isn't that voice. And this really is a thing. Like there is this view of jazz as like the hardest kind of music that you can play, where you need to master like all these things in all 12 keys and be able to play this technically ridiculous, perfect thing. And that is actually like a product of, I gotta say, like the largely white institute of jazz, like at all these jazz universities, just like the one I went to, which, you know, is like, there's a diverse like group of students going there and stuff, but largely white professors at schools, lots of money taking music that was, you know, totally in the African-American tradition, made by Black Americans. Jazz is like Black American music that then has filtered into all these other kinds of music in the modern world, and treating it like it needs to be kind of preserved in amber as this perfect thing that can then be like, everybody just needs to perfect this like style of playing drums and of playing piano and of playing saxophone, where I think that the movie like it sets up this beautiful critique of that. And I'd love to see a critique of that because it's something that I struggle with all the time, or I just struggle with. I like think about a lot because it was something that wasn't like a part of my jazz education, is like that part of it, the cultural part of it, the historical part of it. It was so technical. It was so just like learn to play these changes and like learn to play these whatever upper structures over this chord progression. And everybody was so fixated on that because of course we were. It's like a performance university. Like that's how it works.
For sure.
There wasn't a lot of that historical stuff. This movie sets up this like really like blown out version of that in this dynamic between these two characters, and then totally never even goes there. It's just much more interested in this abusive relationship, which is like okay, but left me a little like it would have been cool if they had explored that a little bit more.
I was going to ask you about the reputation of various schools. Like, is this school Schaeffer Academy? Is it obviously Juilliard, or could it be any school? Like, what are the different reputations of schools in the U.S.? Are there some that are known to be more maybe like Schaeffer than others?
For the audience, Schaeffer is a fictional.
Schaeffer as an institution doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There were things in that depiction of the school that felt really true to me. The feeling of, I remember, so at Miami, Whit Seidner was his name. He was the director of the top band. And we were terrified of him, like when we were freshmen. And you'd be playing in your little like third, fourth down jazz band. And the director of the top band walks into your rehearsal and just sits in the back. And it was very much that feeling that happens at the beginning of this, where when he walks in, everyone's like, oh shit, there's Whit. And, you're kind of like, I better not fuck up. And you hope you don't get called out or have to play a solo, but you also kind of want to stand out. So that feeling works, but that was the only time I think that the school gave me a sense of itself as a program. It was really just this one guy and this one band, which was one thing that they could have used to explore some of these bigger questions. Is, as far as I know, Andrew didn't have a drum teacher. If you're in a university, you have a private teacher who like you meet with every week, who's teaching you the instrument you're playing. Your band director is like a big part of it. You meet in big band like 3 times a week, but there was somebody giving him drum lessons, like actual drum technique lessons. And that was completely removed from this movie. And
you mean you're not supposed to just practice in your room by yourself? Yeah.
That could have been a great opportunity for a character that speaks about the different aspects of the music and speaks about, how Fletcher's kind of crazy and that the other faculty don't agree with him or his methods.
Right.
Yeah. Because there's no one in there in the movie that says that Fletcher's an asshole, other than the fact that he gets removed from the faculty by like I guess social workers or the law,
right? There's
whoever
woman,
it is,
that woman who turns up and is like, we've been wanting to get this guy, but right. And I should say, at Miami, there was a professor who was like borderline emotionally abusive, who was a really intense teacher. I had him as my freshman improv teacher. He made me get really good. There was this that guy was the closest thing to some of the stuff I saw in the movie. He was never physically abusive or anything close, but he was an asshole and he was a hard ass and he was terrifying. And it was like you had to play, and he worked us super hard and we got really good. And that dynamic does exist. Like that's a thing in jazz schools. But he was only one of many professors that I had, and he was a big influence on me freshman year. And then later I looked back and was like, oh, that guy was actually kind of a dick and like sort of sexist. I remember the line when Fletcher comes into the big band and he like makes that crack about the lead alto player. He's like, let's see if you can play in tune if you're just here because you're cute. And then she tries to play and he's like, all right, that's what I thought, and just walks away. Yeah. That's the kind of shit this guy would have said. Like there is a lot of that kind of stuff in jazz programs because jazz programs are super, super male dominated. Like that's a thing. So there was some truth, but just the missing parts of it, the missing drum instructor, the fact that like the drumming didn't make sense, the scenes where he's trying to learn to play fast, like he's just like going completely ham on the drums. He like punches through the thing.
I know.
I was like, what? Get a metronome, dude. Like start simple, play quarter notes on your ride cymbal. Like there is a whole set way to learn to play fast, and it isn't just like full force at the drums with every muscle clenched. You have to play really loose, and you have to start small, and you think in halftime and. Yeah.
That was one of the shots that really frustrated the musician in me because he just like is like, there's a moment where he's just staring at the cymbal and then he's just like, and he just like goes ham on it. Yeah, and it's like, that's how you play drums. You just go,
no. Like, where's your metronome, dude? Like, just start the metronome. Because like, okay, like 300 beats a minute. You can play like really, really fast, but you start just like counting. Like if you're going to play a really fast tune, the way that you count it is like, instead of counting like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, you count it like, like that.
Yeah.
And like, that's, okay, well, that's crazy fast, but like, If we're like here,
Pretty
like that's like 400 beats a minute or something, you have to, it's all subdivision. I don't know. This is like stuff that drummers learn. And there was none of that. They're just like murdering themselves on the drums trying to play it. I'm like, where's the drum professor at this school? Like that guy is falling down on the job.
One of my favorite parts of in theme with that is when he's watching the old his old home movies, and he's like, "Daddy, watch my
paradiddle."
My paradiddle does not play a paradiddle.
Yeah,
whatever. He's a stupid kid.
Yeah, he doesn't.
I do think that the movie did a pretty good job of making it feel like he was playing most of what he was doing. Like he's playing hard mode and rock band, and like the track is actually expert, but most of the time it's pretty convincing. Like,
agree. There's
a couple extra notes, but like it sells, and I was pretty impressed actually that
he's a drummer. The actor is a drummer. They didn't just hire him and then he learned drums.
Oh, really?
As far as I know.
Okay.
He knew how to hold the sticks and stuff. I think that a lot of that was the editing, and I think that's why this film probably won Best Editing. The editing in this movie is amazing, and so much of it is making a drummer who's okay look like he's playing what he's playing. And also, like, this is a really percussive movie in general, and editing is all about rhythm. I've like become more and more obsessed with editing. Like, I don't know anything about making movies other than like whatever I learned by reading books and stuff, but like it's so about the rhythm, right? It's like the rhythm of the scene. When do you make the cut? When do you cut to the different angle? And the rhythm of this movie is like wonderfully rhythmic. I mean, Damien Chazelle is a really talented director. He's got such an eye for this stuff, and he clearly found a good editor to work with, and that's such an important relationship. And so many of those scenes, like where he's drumming, it's so like it hits you physically. Like watching him play, you can really feel it. Also, I feel like this is a beautiful looking movie. It's a really gold movie, I thought. And it looks like symbols. This movie, to me at least, so many of the scenes, it's like black shirts with like bronzed skin. I mean, they're all white guys, but they're kind of like bronze looking. And like the shots of the overhead drum sets with these like beautiful symbols. A lot of good symbol porn in this movie. I was like, ooh, a K-Bosphorus. I kind of want that symbol.
I totally agree. I think on like a technical level, this movie looks incredible. I think it does a really brilliant thing where it's very golden, but it also teeters on like toxic orange, where it actually oversaturates the warm, and it goes too far. And so there's this like balance between like this dream world of being a pro musician and this toxic abuse, and like it teeters. And like even in the final scene when he's on stage, the yellow, the warm is just cranked just a little too much, and it backs off by the end of it when he's having his moment. But I think they do a brilliant job of that. And like on top of that, green used in a lot of places to show people that he's envious of or in his way. And I really appreciate that they do take the time to put those little details in.
That's why this movie seems so dreamlike, is because the entire movie takes place inside the ride cymbal.
It kind of feels that way though. Like it has that feeling of a dream. I mean, that opening shot, that like tracking shot down the hallway as he's playing, like it's cool as a musician or just as a person who watches movies, just to see the act of playing music rendered the way that he renders it. He has such an eye for it, and I mean that's like that stuff is amazing. Like there's really a lot. Just watching this movie was really fun, if the movie itself is not intended to be fun at all and is like such a nightmarish, stressful feeling. But just visually, it really is incredible looking. I can't remember, I think J.K. Simmons also is just amazing in this movie. Of course, he won an Academy Award for it, but like someone described him as like the personification of an erect penis. It was a film critic, and I read this somewhere, and I can't remember now. But it's so like
amazing.
The vibe of like the black T-shirt, and he's like super buff and just like pure, just like and veins down his head, and he's so intense, wrinkly, like really great.
I just will say that the characters in this movie, outside of the two main characters, are a little too shallow for me. Like they only serve to be to offer a character moment or like a plot point to the other characters. Like the girlfriend side story felt so unnecessary to me. And like,
I liked it.
It exists only to give him that scene where he tells us how little of a people person he is, how much he is focused on this music. And I think there's so many other ways they could have done it.
It's okay.
He's a pure asshole. Huge asshole.
Screw that guy.
And it's a good scene, but they spend like 4 or 5 scenes with her, and that information is the only one that we really needed, was that he's so focused.
Not exactly. Even in his first date with her, he's already being an asshole. It almost looks like they're not going to have a second date.
Yeah.
She's pretty annoyed with him, but then they kind of meet in the middle and find common ground.
My question is, why does she like him? She has no reason to like him.
I think she probably admires his drive, maybe. That's a thing.
What we know about her is that she doesn't think that highly of herself, at least in terms of where she goes to school and stuff. So maybe she just likes dating a guy that goes to that school.
It's hard though, right? Because we're like guessing at the motivations of a character who has probably like a minute and 30 seconds of screen time in the whole movie.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they set up that she felt kind of isolated at this school. So like the fact that he came up and asked her out, she's like, ooh, a connection, like some sort of anchor.
Here's my question. Would this movie be better if instead of spending that energy and time on that character, they spent that energy and time on a bandmate, and that they build a relationship with like that, and then they can kind of explore more of the effects of the abuse and more of the angles of how the abused are abusing each other. And you can have like build a little
different
camaraderie.
angles, not the same. Not
no,
the same
totally
angles.
a different angle. Whereas this is just one. I feel like it serves just one point of building his character.
No, I don't know, because I think that the fact that we know so little about the girlfriend and so little is spent on that in the movie enforces this idea of isolation and
totally
like, going
right.
insane.
It's just a question of like what the movie's going to be. So this was apparently a short film, which I haven't seen, and I didn't realize. And it was originally, I think J.K. Simmons was in it, and it was a different actor playing the drummer. And it won a bunch of awards, and Chazelle made it as this short film. And it does have that feeling of like something that would have worked really well as a like 25-minute short about just like 2 or 3 of these sequences that then he blew out to a longer movie. And in some ways it like wasn't quite as elegant, or he was filling it up in some ways, but didn't manage to fill it in quite the ways that would have made it work a little better. Because I hear what you're saying. It's like, it's a question of like, do we want to excise any of these secondary characters at all and just make it about this dynamic that clearly the movie is most concerned with, is like the man and the student and like the way that they abuse one another? Or do you want to have like, it doesn't, maybe not just, maybe give the girlfriend one more scene. Like she could have used probably one more scene. It felt very much like they had one scene together and then he broke up with her in this like really cold, shitty way. And I was like, they could have used one scene beyond just him getting a text from her.
Yeah.
It's like an hour 40 or something. They could have done that.
Another scene that I simultaneously love and hate is the dinner scene with his family when his like football brother and his super brainy UN like representative brother come in. They're like, oh, what do you do with your life? Oh, drumming. That's nice. It felt so amateurish and simple, and like that's a scene we've seen like in like kids cartoons. Like
it seemed not sophisticated enough for
especially not for like
otherwhere.
2014. Like these days, if you are in the top jazz program in the world and you just as a freshman made it into the top, even in any of these schools, any of those schools I just described, if you were a freshman drummer at like New England Conservatory and you got put in the top band or at Miami, you're like, I'm in concert jazz band in Miami as a freshman. Like that's a huge deal, and your parents
would be homeless.
Yeah, your family would understand that that's a really big deal. So it was a little hackneyed. So there's a question of like, would more of that, or maybe making that stuff a little smarter, have made the movie better, or would it have distracted from the thing at its core? And that's totally. I guess it's hard to like try to make a movie better when it already is. You know, it like really is what it is. Like it's very defined in like what it's trying to do. So I guess the answer is remove that stuff and just make it about make it the short film again, I guess. Is the answer.
I didn't know it was a short film, and that actually makes a lot of sense, because I feel like with a short film you might forgive those kind of like unrealistic elements. Because it's so short, you're just like, all right, we're telling a focused story. We don't have time for supporting characters. Because I think the thing that makes this seem kind of unrealistic is how focused in we are on just these two people. We don't see the surrounding universe. And I think that probably worked a lot better for the short film.
It is. There are some good insults in this movie, I want to say.
Oh man.
I wrote down the one is this is a horrible insult, but it's the kind of thing that you would hear on Veep. Like it was Veep level, like, you know, or In the Thick of It level, or The Thick of It level, was limp dick sound, what was it, like limp dick sound note flatter than their girlfriend's flexible tempo dipshits.
I wonder if he ad-libbed a lot of that or
no,
what?
I actually found out. The only line he ad-libbed was like, I wrote it down, but it was very simple. It was like pretentious limp dick or something. Like it wasn't anything crazy. Everything else was scripted out for him.
I gotta say, dipshit. I just like dipshit as an insult. Like,
oh, it's great.
It's got a great, like, speaking of music stuff, like just dipshit has a great sound to it. Like as the ending of like the punctuation of a riff. There's a kind of almost percussive element to how he insults
It's got
people
that sibilance in the middle there.
Yeah.
I have a question for you guys.
Sure.
I felt a little bit weird watching this movie because at parts, I kind of wanted J.K. Simmons in my life. I want someone in my life to push me that hard. And like,
You wanted to push you
Obviously-
that
I actually have
hard, or
someone
just to
like
push
this.
you a little bit?
Yeah, maybe not push you that hard.
My question is, what's the line? Because I think most people want that. They want someone to get the best out of them. Obviously, they don't want this level of toxic abuse, but what's the line? What's the line of acceptable pushing, and where does it cross into abuse?
I actually think it depends on who you are, because I actually have someone like this in my life, and I think that this is actually part of the question, and why I took issue with the fact that he kind of seems to be redeemed when he's explaining his philosophy, and there's no one there to say that his philosophy is garbage, is because if you're not the type of person who's going to respond to this, then it doesn't make you stronger. You just you become fragile, and so there's the question of, everyone in this band, the people who resonate with this teaching style, or they're going to become great. And if they don't, they'll just become mediocre or whatever. And, they weren't going to be great anyway. Well, maybe it's the case that with a different teacher, these people would be great. And there's just different ways to get greatness out of people.
I think if human behavior is a spectrum from being really nice to being a complete asshole, Fletcher is fully on the asshole side. And I think that clearly... I think that would work in certain scenarios. You kind of burn off all the chaff and then the good stuff's left. I think that can work, but at what cost? I think that an approach somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, and maybe more towards asshole, but you're nice sometimes, makes it a little
I don't
better.
even want to say it's a continuum, because I'm saying it's multidimensional. Some of that chaff would have been great stuff if it was nurtured differently.
Yeah. I think that if you're fully on the asshole side, on the asshole spectrum, capitalize asshole, capitalize spectrum.
Sure.
You get only the best. They might. I don't know if you'll get a better drummer by being an asshole who's sometimes nice.
Well, so then it gets into the question of what does it mean for someone to be the best drummer? Because that is also a kind of a rigid outlook, especially when it comes to jazz, which is what makes it so interesting that this movie is about jazz. That drum and bugle corps is much more in the military tradition of music. And that's where a lot of the discipline comes in. And there are section leaders and squad leaders, and you're marching and you're playing. And people get really hardcore, in drum lines and drum corps.
You only get in if you kill a man.
Right. You have to murder somebody there's a whole initiation, right?
With your sticks.
But and there's so much precision required. If you're in a drum line, you have to play exactly, perfectly the exact same as the first snare if you're the third snare, and every snare drum player has to match it. Perfect. The movie Drumline, actually, that's a really fun movie. And that movie actually has a way more nuanced take on music, and it has a lot of really cool drumline sequences.
Whiplash. It's not as good of a movie as Drumline.
Well, it didn't win any Academy Awards, but it's still a good movie. In some ways, it's a better music movie. It's just maybe a better music movie than Whiplash. I would say that. But that's where a lot of discipline comes in. But in jazz, and I don't want to imply that jazz is a looser or undisciplined music, because that's not the case. But you can't grind jazz out of people. You can't grind that kind of improvisational freedom and the spirit of the music out of people. That doesn't work. And I've been in so many programs, and I've taught jazz programs, and the thing that works is you make people want to be great. That's always been the most motivating thing to me. And hierarchy is really good for that. And playing tests are really good for that. And seeing the top band. I did an interview on Strong Songs with my high school band director last year. And we talked about this some, about how our program was set up. There were 4 big bands. You came in as a freshman. You didn't know what you were doing. You would go to that first jazz concert in the fall, and you'd see the top band play and be like, holy shit, I could be in that band. I could be first alto in the top band. I am going to practice for my face off until I can do that.
Yeah, and that's something kind of missing from this movie that made it less believable to me. Again, it's how is Fletcher allowed to exist in this world? One reason might be because he's getting awesome results, but we don't get to see any of that. They don't really reference that he has been the progenitor of greats until they talk about Casey.
Right.
Later on. You never see why do you want to be in this program? We understand that I guess it's an exclusive program, but we don't know he's produced these awesome musicians, or they win lots of competitions, or XYZ. It's never really, it's all just implied.
There is a line. I think that's an interesting question, David. The question of pushing versus incentivizing, because there has to be some pushing. And like I said, I had this professor who was a real hard ass, but he was funny and he was really charming. And like when you did well, you felt awesome. And he never slapped people or like there was mild, like you would be humiliated if you failed a test.
Well, there were a couple of chairs being thrown.
He never threw anything, or at least not that I saw. But there was, like we had to do a test every week and you had to play, he would call a key. So it would be like, we're learning blues and all the flat keys. You had to play a perfect solo in any key he called over the blues with perfect voice leading in time. And if you made a single mistake, you failed and you had to play again the next day. So it was super hardcore and it was very stressful and you had to do it in front of everybody in class. Oof. So there was that element of like kind of humiliation where if you messed up,
but that's also the business. You're playing on stage. Sometimes you have to do a concerto or something.
Right.
But the one element that you referenced just now about that professor, what's missing, in my opinion, from Fletcher is that you like him. Sometimes he's really charming. Sometimes he listens to you like you're the only one in the world, right?
And I think about that with him a lot, for sure.
But Fletcher, they have that one scene where he's giving praise to Neiman at the beginning. But even in that scene, he's scary because he controls him with his arm. He puts his arm against the wall and leans in.
That's a good scene. That's really
kind of intimidating him.
Well, I feel like he's setting him up too, like that he's trying to build him up so that he can pop his bubble.
He's
in the
just
next
playing
scene.
with him. I don't think there's one scene where you're kind of like, is he nice? Maybe Fletcher's nice.
And like
I think at the very beginning of that scene, you're kind of like, what's going on? And then you're like, no, he's just manipulating.
But there has to be some praise. There was actually a blog written about, or a review about this movie from a renowned drum teacher called...
Was that Steve Smith? Did Steve
Peter
Smith
Erskine.
Oh, Peter Erskine. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and he said that, and he thought that you had to dole out about as much praise as criticism for it to work and you to get away with it.
Feels right. Yeah, I know the jazz world had all kinds of takes on this. I'm excited to go read them. I think I maybe read Erskine's thing. I remember reading, I thought it was Steve Smith, but it must have been Erskine, who is just two really good drummers. And him just, this was forever ago when it came out, like talking about the count-offs, like how he, like nobody counts off a band that way, where he's like 3, 4, go. And they're like,
yeah. Someone was saying, give me 4 count, like, because you don't even know the tempo yet.
Yeah, 3, 4, go.
It's funny because I think about Whit would sit there. I did this too because I directed a high school band for a while, and like I would sit on a stool with a drumstick. And you hit the stool with the drumstick to give everybody time. But Whit would bring a Dr. Beat, like a metronome, into rehearsal and just sit there with it on. I mean, time is a really big part of a band. But you can't. There's a weird thing there where he's like keeps expecting them to get a perfect tempo, and like I've never seen that be a thing.
Some of the call-outs just make, I don't know. To me, they made no sense. Where he's like, okay, bar 105, the end of 3. Like what?
Oh yeah, right.
What?
Yeah,
Where?
yeah. Like the they're playing a tune in 7/4, and he's like started the and of 5 or something. You're like, like, why are you?
What do you mean?
Even when he's like, okay, 215, give me that right now. 215, right now. 215.
Yeah.
So backing us up though,
quarter
to this,
note equals 330.
I had a question about that. Like, can musicians just go? They have an intuitive sense for beats per minute. Like, I know 250 beats per minute sounds like this, and they can just do it precisely.
No, I've never seen that be a thing where that is like. Where you have to be that precise at 250 or something. Like any drummer will be able to pretty much play 120 or 60 because you're doing it off of seconds and you just get it in your head. Like when you hear 100 beats per minute, I think that's like Staying Alive. Like there are certain tempos that you just...
The CPR tempo.
The CPR tempo. You get those in your head and you're like, you're good to go. But no, it's not... It's not that I've ever seen. I mean, it could be that there are teachers that do that, and maybe, Chazelle's teacher would do that. But that seems like it's just kind of an arbitrary thing to expect someone to do.
Perfect pitch, but for beats.
Another question I had was when all those sequences where Fletcher's saying, not quite my tempo, are you dragging or are you ahead of it? And I was wondering, is a musician who's more trained than me, did they actually do it properly in the movie? Like, can you hear? Oh, he's actually a little dragging.
Oh yeah,
I can hear that
but
too.
It's yes, that it does happen. That whole sequence where he's making the drummers play and like rotate is this like amazingly done sequence that makes no musical sense. And then the whole "not my tempo" thing. "Not my tempo" is such a good line. I've heard people say that forever, and now the first time we saw it when I was watching, I started laughing just because it took me forever to see this movie. But that is a great line. But that sequence doesn't make sense only because time. In a band, it would be such a weird big band where everybody in the band but the drummer starts playing one tempo, and if the drummer comes in like 10 clicks too fast, no one adjusts, and it just like falls apart immediately. Like that just wouldn't happen. It's like you have an intuitive sense of the timing of the people around you, and even if you didn't give them a good count in, if you were just like 3, 4, go, they'd play, and after one beat, they'd find it with one another.
Yeah.
No
But
one's going to just be in a tunnel.
It would work relative to one another, but I guess if Fletcher is specifically looking for a particular beats per minute that he wants his rendition to be played at, then that kind of makes sense, right?
Maybe the takeaway is that he was being completely unrealistic and he was just
I guess
using
so,
it to
yeah.
abuse
Though,
him.
again, the movie never explains that.
It never tells you
There's
that,
no
yeah.
one to give that very true perspective, like a voice in the movie, and so it just feels like, oh yeah, this is a reasonable thing to ask, but it like doesn't even make sense. Like, why would
It would have helped.
Yeah,
would have
why
helped
would
the
you
movie
ask
so
that?
much, I think, to have that.
One more question. This one's not music. This one's a movie. One of the earliest scenes with Neiman and his dad is in the movie theater, and they share a popcorn, and he dumps the Raisinets in the popcorn.
Yes.
And then his dad finds out that Andrew doesn't even like the Raisinets in the popcorn. He eats around them. What's the point of showing that? What were we?
It's to
I think it's to
tell us
show-
that his dad is a monster, and that's why he's all messed up.
I think it's just
I like Raisinets.
It's like a semi-slick way of describing the relationship of
Yeah,
the
that
dad
there's some
telling him what he
distance.
wants, and that Miles has just kind of like secretly gone under the radar and gotten what he wants separately from him.
I was confused by that though, because it's like, all right, Miles goes along with what his dad wants. I feel like that paints Miles as kind of being a compassionate person,
Or certainly not.
but he's not. So I thought it was. I think I'm with you, James, where it's just kind of confusing from a character standpoint.
Yeah, it's Act 1 stuff, so it's supposed to be like how he starts off before he changes, and he kind of has to dehumanize as he goes towards greatness. So maybe it's trying to show him as just like a nicer person.
What
Putting air quotes
quote,
around
unquote,
greatness.
Yeah. What do you guys
so
think
the
about?
listeners will know.
What do you guys think about Neiman as a character? Because I don't know. I feel like a character with a bit more humanity would have carried the film a little bit more for me. I was just mad at him the whole time. I'm like, you're so dumb.
Yeah, his starting point isn't good enough. I think if you started off at a point where you like him and then he descends into this because of abuse, I think it makes a much more compelling film where you're attached to him and you care and you're like, wow, what a transition. Whereas at the beginning, he's this like loner,
He has no
ambitious
friends.
kid
Kind
anyway.
of has like a punk drunk love kind of vibe to him, where you're like, am I supposed to like him?
How are you the drummer for a jazz band? You have no friends.
Right. There's a sense that he doesn't like get any joy out of the music, which is sort of similar to La La Land, to Ryan Gosling's character in that movie as well, that there's this kind of weird fixation on it that doesn't actually get it. Wow. It's so fun to play jazz drums, you guys. Like,
I know.
It's like the funnest thing in the world. Like, it's awesome.
Jazz is fun. It's supposed to be fun.
But it's a great instrument. It's so great. And like, you never get the sense that he is like catching the groove and like feeling it, which, that's, again, it keeps coming back to this idea of like, what is this movie really about? And it's really about this weird dynamic. I think he's great casting because this is another critic that I can't remember described him as having a face that looks like it can take a punch, because he looks like a boxer. Looks like he has that kind of boxer's nose, and he sort of doesn't make eye contact. And there is something to that, to like the really alpha aggressive abuser, and the like, he sees in this kid not actually talent. What he really sees is this like person who can take it, like who can take his abuse. And that's like, it's really dark, but that dynamic is like a real thing and is really interesting for the movie to get into. It almost is a punt in the end when the movie is like, no, actually he's great. And what he saw in him was the greatness that he needed to bring out. Because what it felt like to me, the whole movie was a way darker and more real thing of just like, he saw someone who he could abuse and who would take it.
Yeah, every abuser finds their victims.
Right.
Because everyone else just leaves. The victim mentality, they stay.
It's so funny because the movie sets up that ending as like this triumphant return where it's like, all right, he was abused by this guy and he finally escaped, but then, he got sucked back in and now he's returning to the abuser. But then he gets kicked out again and he's like, you know what? Not this time. He comes back and, metaphorically slaps Fletcher in the face by playing amazingly, but turns out
Fletcher wanted this the whole time.
Fletcher won in the end anyway.
And that is
he
like
got what he wanted.
Actually like verging up to, if not crossing over into like problematic territory when it comes to like depictions of abuse, of like saying basically, well, in the end, you just need to go with it and like out dominate your abuser and let them like do the thing they knew you could do all along. Like,
I don't want to give too much credit to Fletcher. I don't think that he planned it all. Like he wanted to prank him.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he's in a no-lose situation. Whereas if his plan succeeds, he's humiliated this guy and disgraced him. But if his plan fails, well, then he's got a great drummer on his hands.
Yeah.
I have a question. What was his plan once he left?
What do you mean?
Just going to play the rest of the songs without a drummer?
That's
something I thought was unrealistic.
I thought about that though, because if I was in the band, I'd be so pissed off if my director sabotaged our whole performance and made me look like an asshole. I'm like the second tenor player or something. I'm like, I canceled a bunch of gigs to come do this. Like, and this is all a weird like psycho war between you and like this like
just
high school freshman.
That was one of the parts where I was kind of like, this doesn't make sense to me because like, but maybe Fletcher just like. Maybe he was disgraced in the industry and he's just like, all right, I got this thing, but there'll be more gigs down the line, but I'm going to take this opportunity to teach this kid a lesson.
He obviously had enough cachet to be in that competition with people who respected him, who wanted to play with him.
When we saw him play piano, I'm not really sure where that cachet comes from.
Yeah, I saw some criticism of that scene because
his form is all weird when he's playing piano.
He's just like,
the composer of this movie isn't a jazz player.
Yeah.
And Fletcher's character complains about like Starbucks jazz and how crappy jazz is. Yeah. But then when you go into that scene where Fletcher's playing, they're playing that kind of music, and it's like
he's playing.
No one is going to watch that.
Am I wrong in thinking that they were playing like a soft jazz version of Caravan? I don't remember.
I don't think they were playing Caravan there. It was some standard. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but I think it was more like a Tin Pan Alley song. That scene was funny because I think it was meant to illustrate that as a player, he's actually a very gentle touch, which it did. But the music was fairly dull. He never did anything remotely exciting. And I think it was because it might have even been that J.K. Simmons was really playing. It looked like he was essentially really playing the part. And they couldn't have him doing a whole bunch of crazy shit because then it would look obviously fake. But they didn't need to make him a virtuoso piano player. But there was something strange about that scene. And that... Again, to go back to La La Land, like there's a whole thing in La La Land with jazz where like Ryan Gosling's character just views jazz as it needs to be, like essentially that band, a group of like 4 or 5 guys on stage playing small group swing straight ahead jazz music from the 50s, which is like, there's so many jazz bands now that play like bananas cool music, but it doesn't sound like that anymore because the music has evolved. And like that, again, was just like, okay, here's what jazz is, I guess, to this guy. It's just this really old-fashioned, like 70-year-old thing that, nobody plays anymore because it's 70 years old.
The movie has a cool ending because it just ends on the music. And by the way, Riley, this movie was sick with great speakers. It was a real treat.
Great sounding music, great score. I mean, all the way they used drums, like to emphasize how stressful it all was. Really, really.
So that's how it ends. But I wonder if I would have been more satisfied, or at least it would have been more wholesome if there was like a mid-credit scene, one additional scene where he says to Fletcher, like Fletcher's like, okay, great, you're good now, you can play with me, and he's like, but I'm not going to.
They could have implied that. I think like the ending is great. I mean, it's like a bravura ending, like to just be like, bam. Whiplash, game over. Like, it's so good, even though when you stop and think about it, it's like frustrating in all these ways. And for the reasons you said, I think, Riley, you were saying this, that like none of that made sense. That's, I think, why people read it as a dream sequence almost. Like the fact that the band wasn't like, what are we going to do now? We don't have a drummer. Like,
you're on your own, bud.
Right. Even with all the logical leaps the movie makes, that whole thing is like maybe a bridge too far and feels unbelievable, which then if you see it as a dream sequence, okay. And the ending is so like a mid-credit sequence would undo such a great ending, even though like I don't know what you do. It's like you have to end it that way, but it is a flawed ending. So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I think my last note that I wrote for this movie is this movie is a tragedy because up until that moment, you're kind of like, what's gonna happen? Is he gonna succeed? Is he gonna win? Is he gonna not be crazy? Blah blah blah. And then it just ends with them both kind of achieving this orgasmic
very sexual
success of like this dark success, and I'm like, okay, it's a tragedy. I think I was just trying to decide up until that point what kind of movie it was.
And another factor that adds to that point is the fact that he calls up his ex-girlfriend to come to the show.
Yeah,
and she's like, that's over. She's
moved
moved on by now.
That was also like a really good hallmark of abuse, or people who are abused, where like once they get any sort of approval from their abuser, they are on top of the world.
Yeah,
they're like, oh man, because the only times I think the only times that he goes out of his way to contact her, the first time he asks her out is right after he was praised by Fletcher, and then the second time he calls her is after he's like, oh, I'm getting this gig again with Fletcher. He loves me.
There's
again.
like the one time he's happy on the bus where he gets the text from her, and it's clearly that their relationship is kind of proceeding, and he just had a great thing where he's like ready to play, and I think he just got promoted back into the drum chair or something, and he's like happy for a second, and it's very twisted and convincing. Like that's very well done.
Man, as gruff as J.K. Simmons is, I don't think I've ever actually been scared of him until I watched this movie.
Yeah, he's scary.
Like, he's like mostly comedic with his like, rah, rah, I'm just yelling and like this, blah, blah, blah. But in this one, I was like, oh no, please don't look at me. No eye contact.
Yeah,
it was
he's
actually
a great
scary.
villain.
Yeah. Even from like the first couple scenes, like when he's directing the studio band and Miles is looking in and he just like catches the eye, I was like, whoa!
Oh yeah. You expect like a horror stinger.
Yeah.
Totally.
It's like the alien from Alien.
Yeah, just J.K. Simmons right there at the window.
He like pops up. Oh man.
Oh man.
Guys, I have the most important question about this movie, and this will decide if I like this movie or I don't.
God, here it is.
What happened to the folder?
Oh yeah.
I actually had that in my notes. I was like, but what happened to the folder?
He looks away for what, like 6 seconds? So like someone had to have taken it. Like who took it?
Maybe Fletcher.
It was a janitor. That's the after the credits scene. There's a janitor with the folder.
He was like practicing the Whiplash part, like,
And he's like killing it, like
yeah, getting really good.
Oh,
just like those guys in Iron Man that get the plans and they're trying to rebuild the suit.
Yeah, I like that they don't answer that question. I was wondering if it was going to wind up being like, Fletcher took it to see if what he could do, and I get it was believable that the one guy was like, keep your hands off my fucking music, like that.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah.
And it was like a nice little illustration of the thing we talked about earlier, like how they're all such assholes to one another because that's their culture.
Yeah.
But it was a little, I mean, it was kind of a plot contrivance that it happened at all. And it was just one of those nightmare scenarios that they just kept going out of their way to set up. I mean, that scenario of like, don't lose your music. And then you go and you're like, just going to get a drink. Oh no. And then your music is gone and you have to like tell that it worked.
It ran off
and then
by itself.
Probably better than that they didn't explain it, but I was left asking the same question.
Yeah. That always bothers me in movies when something happens and you know it's just because they wanted it to happen for the plot.
Right.
Like they could have made it more natural, but
the way they executed it though.
They wanted it to be blameless though. They didn't want Neiman to be incompetent in that way and actually have lost it.
And I think it also works though because the rest of the movie has such this dreamlike quality where it's like, okay, we don't know what happened. All we know is that something horrible happened and we can't explain it because jazz isn't like this in real life.
I agree, and it's
fine.
because like when you have the dream, like I seriously have dreams like things that happen in this movie a lot, like where I'm like I'm back in high school but I don't have my music, and when you have those dreams, there's never a reason that it happened. You just don't have your music. It isn't like there's a part of the dream where you forgot your music at home. You're already there, and you just don't have your music, and like the scenario is already unfolding, and that man. I think. Also, like the way that he looks at it and it snaps to the thing, then it snaps again. This is great editing. It snaps to the folder, snaps to him, snaps back, and it's gone. Is kind of like I took it as like a representation of how it felt to him, even though it may not have been what actually happened. Because if you've ever lost something, it's kind of how it feels in your memory. You're like, well, I know I had it and I set it down and it's not there, but clearly something happened, and maybe you picked it up and like put it in another room and forgot about it or something. You know what I mean? But
I like the way you described this early on as like a specific horror film for musicians.
It really is. Like it really, really is.
The
like I was laughing by the end. I was like, the only thing that didn't happen was he was on stage like naked. Like that's all that didn't happen in this movie.
Yeah, he played so hard at the end there. His shirt could have just ripped off.
Right,
I would have allowed it.
It's just like shirt ripped.
Oh man.
Well, thanks a lot for joining us today. I think we beat the hell out of this one.
Yeah. Hey.
My pleasure.
Can't
I'm happy to monologue. I hope I didn't monologue too much about jazz, but I'm happy to monologue about jazz anytime.
No, it was great to pick your brain and get your expertise on the podcast.
It was good to have a reason to watch this movie. I've wanted to watch it for a long time, just because, like, obviously I should have seen this when it came out, and I just sort of didn't. So it was nice to get to watch it.
That you hadn't seen it. That's insane that you hadn't seen it.
Yeah, eventually I started just putting it off because I was like, well, I know I'm going to have all these complicated feelings about it, and I know it's
I'm probably going to get invited to a podcast. I'll have an excuse at some point.
Kind of, yeah. I guess at some point I was like, I'm sure at some point I'll get to go on a really cool movie podcast and talk about Whiplash, which
really cool. Oh, that's nice.
This was a blast.
Well, everybody, if you enjoyed listening to Kirk Hamilton, you want to hear more of his nice, wholesome voice and hear him not swear, then you can go and listen to Strong Songs, where he picks apart and educates you on all things music. Or you can check out some gaming stuff, because you're probably a gamer if you're listening to this. And he's on Triple Click. That's awesome.
Yeah, listen to Triple Click. Listen to Strong Songs.
And if you want to contact us, we are at Carpool Critics on Twitter, and you can email us at carpoolcriticspodcast@gmail.com. And guess what we're doing next week?
Huh?
I said guess. I don't know either.
Oh, I don't know.
We'll figure it out.
Poll time?
What is that? Is that a stripper movie?
We're watching Poll Time. biopic about
10,000 hours on the pole. No idea. Give us your suggestions on Twitter and also give us a review of our podcast because that helps us and we like to be helped. We need all the help we can get.
Please.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thanks, Kirk.
Bye.
Love you.